a very good day to you wherever you are across this Caribbean and beyond the Caribbean. I'm Julian Rogers, and I'm in Kingston, Jamaica. And yes, I know my own name. It's all right. But it's a beautiful day in Kingston. I wish I could show you outside, but I'll save that for another time. But we're here in Jamaica, coping, keeping our eye on everything that's happening around us and around the world for that matter. And of course, there's great preoccupation and anxiety and major concern, and it's an ebb and flow about what's happening about the COVID pandemic and its impact on our region and the rest of the world. We're really part of the world if there were ever a time that there is. And so I thought I'd reach out and talk to someone that I've known for many, many years. I never had a chance to interview him, but as I thought more and more about Dr. Clyde Cave, who is now in Barbados and Chief of Medical Services at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital there, I started to flash back to when I knew him first. In fact, it was Antigua and Barbuda when I went there back in 1971 to work at a radio station called ZDK. And Clyde was in school. And I'm not sure how we met up, but hey, that was such a long time ago. But I often say that he left Antigua and Barbuda and went to Barbados and never came back. But that's a whole nother story, which I'm hoping that he'll trace for us. So, Dr. Cave, welcome to Caribbean Bridges.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the invitation and great to see you again.
All right, I might tell the audience that I got you at a bad time where your throat is concerned, but I hope it will hold up as we talk about this. But let's go back to 1971, though. You were in school where?
I was at St. Joseph's Academy in Antigua. My father was a very smart man in many ways, and every time I wanted to pursue a career in something, he had a friend in the business, and I worked there as a summer intern, and by the end of that, I wanted to do something else. And I think he was a little bit surprised when I wanted to do mass communications or something like that. So we met at ZDK, and in those days, the disc jockeys weren't so good at reading the news, so they brought me on, and you taught me how to read news and actually do the occasional interview. So any public relations that I do now, it's all because of you.
Well, boy, I tell you, I clean forgotten that. I knew there was a school connection, but I couldn't quite remember. But now you talk about it. Those obviously the days of King Franchi, who was there with the grammar school guys that went on to be so popular, C. Jags and Frankie Michael and all of them. Hey, those are great days for school. We really welcome the presence of all these young people at ZDK, and I'm really, really happy to see where you've all gone in various directions and levels of success. All right, so those are the school days in Antigua. How come you ended up in Barbados?
My father was Barbadian, so mommy was Antiguan. I came to Barbados to do A-levels at Lodge School, where as a boarder, I was away from home, met up with lots of other Caribbean people who are friends to this day. Got my Barbadian passport because in those days, Antigua was not contributing to the medical school. So it was financially advantageous to be a Barbadian. And I don't know if it was a sense of giving back to the people that sponsored the education, or really it was the love of living in Barbados, because I've always enjoyed here. I came back for my internship when paths crossed again, because I think you were in Barbados briefly in the early 80s. I then did my pediatric specialty training in Toronto between 82 and 89 when I came back as a consultant. And since then, the career has been in Barbados in various aspects: private pediatric practice, hospital development of the newborn intensive care unit, which is my subspecialty. But as you get older in medicine and you have institutional memory, they push you into management. And when this opportunity recently came up to be director of medical services, it was a choice between standing on the sidelines and complaining like everybody else, or helping out with some of the administrative stuff so that we could do the doctoring, which is the whole focus of what we do. So here I am as Director of Medical Services at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
I'm so tempted to say, look, baby doc. Why children's medicine?
It was a natural progression. I don't have the surgical personality. When there's a problem, I would like to step back, sit down, and reflect. Surgeons have to make a decision, right or wrong, and proceed. In medicine, then, it was adult medicine, geriatrics, pediatrics. I found the pediatrics hopeful. The beginning of life seemed to hold more of an appeal to me than the end of life. Kids liked me, I liked them, and it just progressed. The opportunities came up. I really enjoyed every step of the way, which I think is what you have to do to last in medicine for a long time. It does take a lot out of you, and if you're not enjoying it, if you don't have the thrill that people in their profession have for what they do, then it's not worth the effort. But it's been good to
So,
me, and I have been satisfied with many of the accomplishments.
talk to us about the grounding, so to speak, in medicine in the Caribbean. Your training first.
In those days, all of us went to Jamaica, and I really regret that we don't do that anymore, because that was sort of almost the definition of networking within the Caribbean medical community. We were all of a similar experience for at least part of our training. We knew a lot of the eminent physicians and surgeons who were at the university hospital. We always had a point of referral. And it was an excellent experience in growth, I think, as a Caribbean person. I guess having lived a relatively protected life in Antigua and then at boarding school in Barbados, walking through Papine and seeing the poverty there in a Caribbean context that was as warm and as green as everything else, but socially so completely different. That was an eye-opener, and the social and preventative medicine that we were able to do and look into how people in our region live. That still stays with me to this day, because I have never seen those conditions elsewhere in the Caribbean on that kind of scale. So it was a wonderful exposure to be in Caribbean or third world, not just Antiguan or Barbadian.
All right. So that Jamaica experience, I have to tell you, is very similar to that I had back in the 70s when I came here as one of the first of the students to attend the CARIMAC program at the University of the West Indies. I agree with you. You never ever forget that experience, going through Papine, Augustown, etc., and learning. I have to share with you that halfway tree was not Kingston.
Yes, that was also an eye-opener when you saw the rest of Greater Jamaica, that it was not all the North Coast, which was more similar to the Caribbean that I up until then had experienced. But the culture in Jamaica just jumps out, their love of music, the paintings, the whole concept of art as a West Indian expression. A lot of us at that time in the Southern Caribbean, our aspirations were to be Miami South, a satellite of the US, and copy somebody else. Jamaicans, they were always very proud of things Jamaican. And, that was, I think, a formative experience as well.
So the training in Jamaica led next to where?
In those days, we could go back to Barbados or Trinidad for a final year. So after a Sunday afternoon experience in Halfway Tree, when we went to get supper and there was a gunfight across the street, my mother requested her only son to return to Barbados. I had never seen gunfire up close. I was amazed that there was actually a flame from the end of the gun. I actually didn't run, because where I came from, that kind of big bang was the sound of a car backfiring. It was only when a Jamaican friend said, "Run, you damn whatever." It's bullets. But Jamaica in the early 70s was not in the mid 70s, not the best time for Jamaica. It was extremely violent. The army, there were tanks out at night. There was barbed wire surrounding all the entries to the Mona campus, helicopters flying over at night. It was only after coming back home and breathing out that I realized the kind of tension that we were all living under at that time. So it was back to Barbados for final year and then internship. And having decided on pediatrics, I moved to the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, which is world renowned as a care hospital as well as a teaching program, where I did my basic pediatrics, did a fellowship in adolescent medicine, which was groundbreaking at that time. My mentors in Barbados said, "Why are you wasting time with that? We'll never be able to afford the luxury of looking after teenagers and lifestyle problems. We have more urgent things to do." And I had been torn between that and newborn care, neonatology. We didn't have a newborn intensive care unit in Barbados. Dr. Bertie Graham, who was also one of my mentors, suggested that this would be a very useful subspecialty to have. I enjoyed it. And at the same time that I was training, they got a loan from the World Bank to build our intensive care unit, so that when I came back, there was at least a building, so that we then started with training staff, medical, nursing, and growing the expectations of the country from, babies, especially premature or very sick babies, dying quite early, to being able to provide a ventilation service and change the expectations of mothers and families for children here in Barbados. At that time, I think I was one of 2 neonatologists in the entire Caribbean. There was a second and soon a third, Dr. Zuleika Ali, in Trinidad at the university. And it grew from there. We shared our experiences, because the training I got in neonatology in Canada did not immediately transfer to coming back home. If the unit was full, they taught you to say, "Well, we'll refer you to another center." Coming back home, we were it. If we didn't have it and couldn't make it, then it didn't exist. So it was, in those early days, a very interesting experience of developing a program with what you have, making friends both from abroad and within the region, and watching the subspecialty grow.
Where did the work with the World Pediatric Project come?
This has been a more recent development. Over the 30 years in pediatrics in Barbados and the region, you realize that sometimes there are gift horses that make all the difference. There was a wealthy benefactor from the Grenadines who wrote a check for the improvement of the healthcare and well-being of children in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this was vested in the World Pediatric Project, which is a US-based charity, to develop this program. And over years, the model they used was a series of missions that would come into St. Vincent and deal with whatever problems that were there. One month it would be a surgeon, the next month it would be a neonatologist to look at the babies, next month it might be a specialty in ear, nose, and throat, that kind of thing. The need was great enough for them to actually build an operating room and keep at the Milton Cato Hospital in St. Vincent. And as they whittled down the waiting list and word spread, the surrounding islands also had need. So WPP, as an international charity, were able to expand their funding base and reach out into, Grenada, St. Lucia. The focus initially had been on the nursery, and they were looking around for a Caribbean partner. At one time in Barbados, we used to accept referrals of small and premature babies from the other islands. But not only was that expensive, but the outcome wasn't great because we don't have a transport team. And this is a specialty where you have to get going. You can't wait for 48 hours while you beg a ride on Liat and arrive in, another island in bad condition. So we realized pretty early that we all had to work together, even if there was going to be a referral hub of a unit that had higher specialty services that could be provided. So they invited me to join to come down to St. Vincent, where I had been doing some work before with the St. Vincent government on their nursery. And we developed programs of training the nurses, getting donated equipment, bringing some of their nurses to Barbados to have the experience in our NICU, because at first the funding was for those nurses to go to a hospital in the US of A. But that turned out, as we learned, not to be a great experience because the culture gap was too great. They were being trained to use equipment which we didn't have in St. Vincent, and to do things that they would never be allowed to do. Whereas in Barbados, it was a couple steps up, but still relevant when they went back home to improve their services. So having had that experience with the newborn program, when they asked me to help with extending it to the other islands, obviously the Antigua connection, St. Kitts and Montserrat, where my family were originally from on my mother's side, it all has been fitting together as a, I think we're calling ourselves an Eastern Caribbean neonatal network. We're allowed to make up our own names since it's a non-governmental organization. And we held a conference 2 years ago where they got US funding to allow people looking after babies in these islands to come together. And it was really wonderful because it was the first time that people could share their experiences, talk about solutions that were practical, not the kind of things you'd read in a textbook, because even if you reach out to your mentors or research articles, the available resources are not the same. So we have been growing that program, and I have been assisting now, not just in that newborn program, but in the referral of other surgical problems within the Caribbean. Because while their first program was to take everybody to the continental USA, one of the gifts, I suppose, of COVID is to force us to think in different ways and develop alternatives. So some of those cases that would automatically have gone to the USA are now coming to Barbados, where we are able to have more of a regional and a Caribbean focus than we would have had before. So it kind of all comes together.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you a chance to have a swig to help that throw the yours. I'll have one as well. But let me remind you that I'm having a conversation with Dr. Clyde Cave, who is Director of Medical Services at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. Is the largest medical facility there. And of course, it's a teaching hospital as well. And let me bring back Dr. Cave in here now. That has given me a chance to, because he's had a throat challenge all week, like many of us from time to time. But let me ask you, focus on related matter, because you talk about competence and confidence in the Caribbean health sector. And I know that back in 2017, you did make a grand charge about the training of doctors, particularly, and the need for far more specialization than has been occurring. Now, I'll ask you that question because at the same time here in Jamaica, some months ago, there was a great big outcry by a number of young doctors who said that the public service could not accommodate them. And I was surprised to hear that, because I thought immediately there are clearly a lot of health challenges across the communities of all our Caribbean countries, and there must be room enough, or there must be a demand for every doctor we can produce. Tell me.
It depends on what you mean by demand, because it's quite specific. When the university hospital started its medical school in the 1950s, I think with a group of, around 20 from across the islands, there were specific needs in each island. Anything was more than they had. In those days, though, you could have generalist doctors who could function within a multitude of specialties. As time has passed, medical science has grown, expectations have risen. We have produced more doctors per year and grown. When I was at medical school, I'm UWI class of 1980, I think there were about 100 of us from across the Caribbean. Um, right now, there are approaching 350 or 400 at the Mona School alone. There are near 150, I believe, to 200 at St. Augustine. There are 50 to 100, depending on the year, here in Barbados, and also a cadre in the Bahamas. So we're producing somewhere like 600 doctors every year. Now, if you do the demographics on paper and sort of, divide the population by the number of doctors, you might show a need. But a lot of those needs are in rural places where our modern doctors don't want to go. And they probably need specialty training. The old MBBS degree, I think in the charter it was to train doctors to a level where they could work as physicians in the Caribbean. Now a lot of our demand is for specialists, so the MBBS degree has to be upgraded through residencies and fellowships, which are another 4 or 6 years of training, some of which we have in the region, and some of which we have abroad. And when you go abroad, it's been my experience that not all our doctors return. They may be seduced by the lifestyle, by the medical lifestyle as well, because certainly you can be overtrained to come back to some of our developing or underdeveloped health facilities. So it's a commitment to come back and make up systems rather than fall into a job where everything is already laid out for you. And over time we've moved socially where the expectations of doctors is not so much necessarily to give as to receive. I think that's part of it. There have been lots of changes as well, but I also think how would one describe the insularization of medicine, where here in Barbados, you can go to school at primary school, secondary school, university and medical school, internship, and depending on your subspecialty, do a subspecialty here under the aegis of the University of the West Indies. So you can become a consultant, never having been exposed to a population of greater than under 300,000. When we look at the pediatrics program, there are experiences, Jamaica and Trinidad, the Bahamas and Barbados, that are all very different. And if we pooled together and rotated our residents through them, I think we would come up with certainly a very well-rounded pediatrician in this specific instance. But keeping them in their own islands, number one, they only know the system that they have. So when it breaks, they have no experiences of other things to draw on. So we seem to keep wanting to recreate broken machines. And I think that, fundamentally is one of the difficulties that we've created for ourselves.
All right. Okay, let me just encourage people. I know you all have questions, etc. I see some of them coming in already. Be sure to post them as quickly as possible because we'd like to have Dr. Cave reply to them. I know that you're very anxious to talk about vaccines, and in fact, that is where I want to go to next. And the question I have for you, Dr. Clave, is this. We all grew up having been vaccinated as children. We all also go to the drugstore and buy a lot of drugs, and we really don't ask where it's made, where it's come from. But we have a situation today where people are suggesting that if something does not come from the United States or from the United Kingdom, then it's not good medicine. And far more than the whole preoccupation, anxiety with whether a vaccine is safe, whether it's been produced too quickly, and all these matters. Now, you're a doctor with clearly an excellent and respected bedside manner. I want you to address that to this patient population of the Caribbean.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm not sure what I'm going to say because it is something that has been perplexing me for the duration of this epidemic, wanting to have a vaccine and then frankly being disappointed here in Barbados with the number of people, sometimes within healthcare ranks, who opted not to take it. And really, I still don't understand. I think I'm learning more about the impotence of science and reason over social and peer pressure. For example, I would have thought that some of our nurses who are working on the front line would be really welcoming of a vaccine. These are some nurses who bring their young children to me to vaccinate, so I know they are not anti-vaxxers. But when it came to this opportunity, many of them declined and they wanted to wait longer to see what would happen. And I never got the sense that that was the real reason, but it's certainly what they were saying. And even pointing out, well, while you wait, COVID won't, and you're on the front lines. How do we reconcile this? And it's been a journey. I can tell you that with many of, and I'm not only focusing on nurses because they're the only ones who declined. It was among many groups, although our physician uptake was somewhere between 70 and 80%, the nurses less. When we had our first healthcare worker death, who was a nursing assistant, and when we had our first COVID associated death in a child, which was not a death from direct COVID, but from the complication, the newly described MISC, multisymptom inflammatory disorder in children. That really upped the demand from persons who had declined on the first opportunity. But then the mechanics of our vaccination rollout is when the first 50,000 doses were received here and we rolled it out to healthcare workers first and then moved on to other vulnerable populations, the aged, comorbidities, nursing home residents, etc. Now that other people are wanting to have the vaccine, we're on a little bit of a pause, having used up our first major supply and waiting for the second shipment to actually arrive so that we can extend. And I've been reflecting a bit on this when you hear all the excuses. I remember being shocked when I was in Jamaica, and in the 70s, family planning was being introduced. And the concept, for the first time I heard in Jamaica, that it was a CIA plot and things were being implanted into people's bodies. The discussions you hear now about implanted chips is sort of resonant, and you kind of wonder, what is it in us that is susceptible to that? And I remember also the anti-polio stance for the polio vaccine and how it was influenced in Jamaica, because one of the things we have learned, this illustrates, the people in Jamaica actually had a lot of cases of polio and personally knew someone who was affected. One of my good friends was a physiotherapist. Both her parents had polio and met at the Mona Rehab Center. So they were more susceptible to accepting polio to fix something that they knew of rather than something nebulous. Fast forward to the AIDS epidemic, where we have all been hoping for a vaccine. But in the interim, when there were intermediate measures of safer sex, etc., there was also the experience that people tended to ignore it as a real personal threat. And there would have been a variety of excuses, maybe believed or maybe convenient, until they knew someone personally who had been affected. And that seemed to make all the difference in the HIV epidemic, as individuals, as societies willing to fund the antiretroviral treatments and so on. So it seems that as people in our region are faced, unfortunately, with tangible and real outcomes, very sick people or deaths, we have this standby and let's see the why not mentality rather than embracing vaccination as an added tool. You know, we had the same thing with masks. At first, people didn't want to. Now it's been generally accepted that that is the thing to do. And certainly here in Barbados, if you're not wearing a mask in public, you will be reminded. Sometimes even driving by yourself in your car, people on the side of the road will point out that you don't have on a mask. Your windows are up and the AC is on. But, you know, we have reached that stage where it's now become socially acceptable. The hand washing thing and temperature taking, you know, you can't go anywhere without having, you know, somebody squirt hand sanitizer at you and remotely take your temperature. The distancing thing has been a little bit more difficult because it's probably the biggest ask and the most inconvenient thing. And we have learned a lot about human nature and asking them to change their behavior. But in addition to all this, to keep safe, and if we're doing these things, it doesn't seem to make sense to me that we would then decline another means of protecting, if not ourselves, our families and loved ones. So that's why I said I'm a bit perplexed about this vaccination refusal. I have certainly had it. All the physicians, to my knowledge, have had it. It is certainly the medical advice. The science is emerging as more and more clear that this is an important tool. Nothing is ever going to be 100% protective. There is a lot of politics and big pharma wars involved when dollars are involved and who will be regarded as the vaccine of choice. You know, they are playing, I think, some unfortunate games with selective quotation and misrepresentation of some of the preliminary research, which explains why a statement today may be retracted in a couple of weeks' time. And this is actually fueling the people who think that the science hasn't gotten it right because they are constantly changing. I would say evolving, but from another perspective, you can quite see if your mindset is not to want to participate. You can find selective reasons to make you think that you're onto something.
Okay.
I was thinking a little bit, Julian, about the
Yeah.
human nature of this whole thing, because that was a lesson we learned in Barbados. We did very well, and perhaps we can talk about that last year, coming up till around Christmas time. And because I've been privy to some of the highest national levels of discussion, I know that health by our Prime Minister, Minister of Health, the governing authorities, health has always been defined in the broadest context, not just the physical health, but also the social and mental well-being. And it would be fine to close down the country, isolate, and suffer the economic fallout and the social fallout, which would probably include a rise in crime from a large percentage of people who would be unemployed and becoming desperate. So it was really attractive, I think, around Christmas time, when it seemed possible that there were models of opening up selectively to increased visitors. There were two factors that we didn't count on. One, I think, was the emergence of the UK variant that was actually more transmissible. So, you know, the rate of transmission that we had been accustomed to suddenly exponentially increased, and a lot of our visitors were British. But the other thing was human behavior. The visitors didn't exactly want to conform to the restrictions and stay in their rooms that the government was expecting, or that some of the people in Barbados were expecting, while others were encouraging them to be here on holiday and go out and spend some much needed dollars in the old ways, which obviously would have been breaking protocols. But we also didn't bargain on, I think, the Barbadian public who perceived an easing up of tourists as an easing up for them. It was Christmas and the desire to have family gatherings and get-togethers. And I don't think we had really thought through very well the impact of our students and family who returned from abroad wanting to socialize with family and also socialize with friends and spread the virus. So this created the kind of environment where our cases rapidly started to increase, as you would expect in the early part of the year, several weeks after these activities, and continued on the rise, requiring more and more drastic restrictive activities to the point now where it's apparently being much better controlled. Our numbers indicate that we've got a lot of the hotspots under control. We have vaccinated near 60,000 people to date. Things are becoming controlled, but it almost seems that you have to have very strict measures to keep people, to encourage them to do the sensible thing. And as soon as you release that, they make decisions that kind of have the same pattern repeat itself. And yes, that was Christmas. We're about to face Easter. And, we would not want to go through the same experience of being in a better place, relaxing and taking off again. I know there are
Let me,
waves, ups and downs
yeah,
of COVID. That's our new
let me,
life.
yeah, let me then bring you to the point because I think that that background is very important. So the vaccine is being made available or will be made available in far more larger quantities over time. But the anxiety is going up or it's going down from time to time. And I wanted to look at the matter of the European Medical Agency, for instance, and the activities in Europe. Let's deal with Europe as a whole. The mixed messaging there, uh, reaching all the way to Chancellor Merkel of Germany, suggesting that she wouldn't take it, and then coming back and saying, okay, well, I'm not old enough to take it, etc. But the fact is that you have this confusion among the European states. Now you have the European Medical Agency declaring quite clearly that the vaccine is safe and that the references to the blood clots are not linked at all. Now, I always say that when something like that happens, you have to have a a free gathering at Sabina Park and Kensington Oval and the Queen's Park Oval and invite everybody to be able to right that wrong. How do we go about getting people to understand two things? One, that it is not an Indian vaccine, and two, that the vaccines, whether they be Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson and Johnson, are all from the same base and therefore quite safe.
Right, because there is enough nuance in the details to allow people to obfuscate. To start off with, once things have been said, it's really hard to unsay them, especially when there are kernels of truth in things. Now, the blood clots did happen in people who had received the vaccine. But blood clots also happened in people who did not receive the vaccine. Blood clots in the legs would be expected to increase in an elderly population that is suddenly restricted in their physical activity. And we also know that this virus has a propensity, when you have the virus, to create some amount of clotting. So the initial discovery, without taking the time to scientifically distill all this and sort it out, can be used for various political and financial gains. And I really have to say I've become increasingly aware of the commercial and marketing thrusts in the vaccine versus the science. For example, the whole Indian vaccine story. Well, there is an Indian vaccine that they have developed and which they are using in India, but that's not the vaccine that is being used around the world. We are using vaccines manufactured there by the Serum Institute of India, which is not only one of the most respected vaccine manufacturers. They manufacture about over 50% of the world vaccines, and certainly in our public health system in Barbados, Serum Institute of India has been our source for the diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, rubella, chickenpox vaccines that we've been using for years. So, you know, the emotional connection between those things, I think people may use them for ulterior motives. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is the one we have had in Barbados to date, was academically developed with, you know, from Oxford University with the highest academic credentials. Even though in the rush they did manage to mix up some of the data initially, which has been, even though rectified, exploited. And even though fortuitous in showing us that the shortest period of time with which you could give the second dose isn't the best period, that time is actually not 4 weeks, which was the shortest time in which they tried in the trial because of everybody wanting to get everything done soonest, that it's closer to 10 to 12 weeks to give the best immune response. And when you stop and think about it, we all know this because babies have vaccines at 2, 4, and 6 months, spaced out 8 to 10 weeks apart to allow the immune system to give the best possible result. So a lot of the learning steps have been magnified and twisted and contorted, both in, I think, the scientific and pharmacological communities, but certainly in the political arenas with Brexit and the funding and the refusal to share vaccines and all their political turmoil being exported to our part of the world.
Clyde, Dr. Clyde Cave is the Director of Medical Services of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados, the country's largest health facility there. We're talking to him about, well, we range over some of his career, but most importantly, taking the opportunity to understand the whole matter of the vaccine discussion. Dr. Cave, from your point of view, I think that it would be interesting to talk to people about what you see down the road in terms of once the vaccine has, you know, we reached herd immunity, that we can literally go back to normal, or there is no such thing as back to normal?
Honestly, we don't know the answer. I think there will be a new normal. We're dealing with a very crafty virus that keeps changing and giving us variants, some of which are important because the vaccine may or may not be effective against them. Some are important because they're more lethal or spread faster. The prayer is that one of them will be very fast spreading but less lethal, and that will give us all our natural immunity without having to have a vaccine. But you know, you can't wait and hope for that. We have to deal with the hand of cards that we have been dealt. And right now, our best chances are a multitude of actions. The local individual actions of hand sanitizing and wearing masks and personal distancing and rethinking our lifestyles so that we don't congregate in large groups or even small groups any longer. Then there will be the public health things that I think will change. Mass vaccine, and this is where it's an interesting discussion of individual benefit versus benefit to the society. But I think this is now the time for us to extend our hours of operation so that everybody isn't working in the same colonial hours. I referred to them as Nelson hours the other day because we got rid of Nelson but kept all the other colonial trappings of the 8 to 4 with a half day and off on the weekends. Yeah. You know, as an accident, if we had been Spanish, we'd have been having siestas and working in the evening. Socially, I know with online schooling, a lot of parents, it would be an advantage to them to be able to be at home in the morning, to go back to school with their children and figure out how to do that, and then work staggered hours in the evening. It would certainly help address the rush hour traffic and the problems in all our islands. So it's almost like this is an opportunity to address many of the things that we have been wrestling with for a while. And I hope that this will be part of a good part of the legacy of dealing with COVID. You know, I hope the future will have parts of it that are better than our normal before. And I can certainly see maybe a concern for our neighbors and our community as being a change from the I generation where everything is about me. And if that's part of where we move to, I'm all for that.
I want you to answer one of the questions posed by one of the viewers, uh, making the point that the vaccines were approved in the United States and so on for emergency use. Do you see that being transferred to permanent use?
Yes, maybe not the vaccines in the exact configuration that we have now. Emergency use, medically speaking, means that they have gone through testing to ensure their immediate safety, and that on balance, that safety profile would be advantageous when compared with the risk of catching COVID and being severely affected or spreading it to people who could be severely affected. You know, vaccines have over time been refined. I remember when we first started with the chickenpox vaccine, and the immunity in children was really looking good. The studies at 10 years showed that the immunity held. So it was being marketed as a one shot to prevent chickenpox. But as you continued, and it took over 10 years, obviously, to do this, at 11, 12, and 15 years, that immunity waned. So it was then realized that they needed a booster shot, so that immunization against chickenpox now is 2 shots. The first one, at a year or thereabouts, and the second one in early childhood at about 6. And as far as we now know, that will give you immunity for 20 plus years. So there are constant refinements. Vaccines always respond to the disease burden. We know viruses like the 1918 flu epidemic do sometimes behave in strange ways and kind of burn themselves out. And certainly that is a hope and a prayer, but not something that I think we can necessarily sit back and wait for the millions of people to die like they did at that time. So some form of vaccination, if not against COVID, against emerging health threats while we keep control. You know, I mean, we've been doing it for a long time, but we still have not been able to eradicate polio worldwide. And while we have done a great job in many places, every so often, you know, it pokes its ugly head up and we have to double down and do it again. So yes, I do think going forward, public health measures and vaccines as a tool are going to be part of our new normal.
Looking forward as well as looking at the people behind the first elements of this vaccine out of Germany. They were working, for instance, on a cure for cancer. And it is their work that really is the foundation of the current vaccine. Now, a lot of people question the speed with which these vaccines have come into force. Would you explain why this is possible?
It's not original research starting from ground zero. People have been working on this for a long time. You know, if you stop and think about it, every year we do come out with a new flu vaccine to deal with 3 or 4 of the circulating viruses for that and the coming year. So the technique of using an adenovirus as a carrier and inserting part of the protein of this new virus so the body can develop immunity against that. That's something that that technique is well known, and it's the technique of the Oxford, AstraZeneca, and Johnson and Johnson vaccines. The messenger RNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and Moderna ones, are a newer technology as it comes to vaccines, but it's actually been a very clever way of using the body's own natural functions to fight off an unwanted visitor. And many times that unwanted visitor would have been cancer. So that's where the work was. You use messenger RNA to take something that you want the body to fight against into the cells and have the body develop its own immunity to that. We know how it works for polio and tetanus and chickenpox. Wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to make it work for prostate cancer, cancer of the cervix, breast cancer? So when we identify the different types of those cancers, there's a whole hope that we will be able to take a sample of the cancer, identify the parts of the cancer in the lab, add it to this carrier virus, develop a vaccine, give it back to that person, and that person's own immune system gets rid of that invading cancer. I think one thing we have learned with the speed of this, if you throw enough money at something, you can get development at a lot faster rate than if you don't. And, this technology could have been for cancer. Hopefully it will. It was forced by COVID. Maybe this, again, is one of the silver linings of going through this pandemic.
As you talk about tossing money at the problem, I'll come back and ask you the Bill Gates question. But first, there's a question from somebody asking whether if you have migraines, you should take the jab.
I would imagine if you had migraines and didn't take the jab, your headaches would get exponentially worse as you worried about every time somebody in your vicinity coughed. There is no contraindication to migraines. There is some, if you wanted to stretch it, that some of the people who have had big reactions to vaccines are also those people who have big reactions to all sorts of things, strawberries, eggs, penicillin, whatever. Those are what we call atopic individuals. And an atopic individual can have asthma, eczema, sinusitis, rhinitis, and yes, migraines. So if you wanted to pick out that one little bit, that's probably not an accurate reflection. If there are any concerns, obviously you talk to your doctor to customize your individual risks, but just having migraines would not be a contraindication. No.
Okay. All right, here's another question. I'm trying to read it now. How can we regard it as a vaccine if it doesn't prevent the transmission or contracting of the virus? Explain.
Now, again, words do matter. Many of our vaccines work by educating, if you wish, our immune system to react to the virus or an invader, which by definition means you have to be invaded by the virus for the immune system to kick into gear. So that's why it will probably, the vaccines we use now, which develop the body's immune system, your white cells and B and T lymphocytes and antibody production, that part of our host defense, you have to have the virus get into the body to stimulate the reactivation of this system, which the vaccine has trained the body to have on standby. So technically, you would have to have the infection to activate this response, which is why they are now seeing that maybe people can catch the virus, and if you look for it, you will detect it, but they are going to be asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic, and the body's immune system is not going to allow that infection to progress to the very serious effects like ventilation and death that it can have. So you will hear people say that if you have the vaccine, it may not prevent you getting infected. It certainly would protect you from getting very sick or dying. And the whole thing is totally compatible with how the system works. The only vaccine that I can think of that might protect you from getting infected is the oral polio vaccine, which develops your immunity inside your gut, inside your bowel, and that can attack the polio virus before it enters your system. Whereas the injectable polio vaccine, you actually have to get the polio virus into your bloodstream, and then it springs into action. So all these things do fit in with the science and exactly how we know that vaccines work.
Last time around now, I want to ask you about the Bill Gates myth, or well, let me give you a chance to say what it is about Bill Gates and the millions or billions of dollars that he's pouring into health that makes people worry.
I think there are people who see altruism and a real desire to help humanity. And there are people who see selfishness and ascribe a motive to other things. I'm starting to be, maybe this is an age thing, of the belief that there are kind of maybe two basic kinds of people in the world like this. Those who see the conspiracies, and in my experience, a lot of them tend to function in conspiracies themselves, and those people who are more willing to ascribe an altruistic motive, and those to me tend to be people whose life view and practice tends to be more giving. The argument would be those people are innocent and unaware. I always think that when you have a choice or between something being good or bad, I would want to go with good. If it's between hope and skepticism, all evidence being equal, I would like to choose hope. I'm sorry, Julian, I lost your sound completely there.
I was saying that in the final moments, I want you to deliver a message to the Caribbean community about the future of health.
We have come a long way. We have battled many of the conventional diseases of yellow fever and polio. We have new challenges, many of them of our own making, the non-communicable diseases, the lifestyle impact on cancers, the effects of having an aged population. I think we have to rethink our definition of health, or maybe not so much rethink, but remember that health has always been mental, social, and physical, and you could add spiritual well-being. The focus on the physical, I think, needs to be expanded. Now may be our opportunity to focus on social, mental, and spiritual growth.
Dr. Clyde Cave, someone I've known from school days, his school days, not mine, joining me from Barbados. He is the Chief of Medical Services of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. Thank you very much, Clyde.
It's been a pleasure, Julian. All the very best to you and yours, and please stay safe.
And thank you to all our listeners and viewers for joining us here on Caribbean Bridges. I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston.